start with the easy one. When did you get involved with this case?
Well, I was part of the cold case unit, and we would periodically, almost on a monthly basis, review cases that we're looking at or could potentially look at. And it was after we got a letter that dealt with accusations of sexual abuse that referenced Gerald Robinson's name that the cold case detectives started remembering that there was a suspect by that name from a case years before, and they pulled out the file and we started looking at it as a unit.
And that's interesting because this letter clearly it mentioned like BDSM and stuff, and he was violent and abusing her, but there's also some other stuff that maybe someone might say, well, that's a little crazy. I don't know if that happened. So what about it? Was it because he was the lone suspect back in 1980 that really kind of perked up your ears and kind of restarted this whole thing?
Well, you're correct. The accusations in the letter were pretty extreme, and some of them hard to accept as being true. But just his name stuck out. It resonated with the investigators that he was a suspect many years before, and it was really the investigators, Rost and Forrester, that decided to start going down that road.
So when you're looking at that, and again, he was the lone suspect according to, I believe, Assistant Chief Vetter back in 1980. So when you were looking at this case and his name comes up again, this thing hasn't been solved in 23 years at that point. What did you think you needed? What hurdle did you think you needed to get over?
Well, I can tell you I was one member of the team, and my personal inclination was I wasn't very excited about putting in the time and effort on this case because of the age of the case, the fact that he was a priest, and that's a pretty good high hill to have to overcome. And should we really be looking at one of the other cases that maybe would have presented a little bit greater chance for success? What happened with the matter, frankly, was the investigators did such a good job of research, bringing forth the items of physical evidence, finding witnesses that were still alive, that they presented a compelling case, and we felt we have to follow the evidence. So here we go.
So personally, let me just ask you about this because you kind of alluded to it right there. I mean, it's a lot of pressure. You take a shot at a priest and try to convict him of murder, which has never been done to that point in the United States, a priest murdering a nun. What were you thinking when you're suddenly the guy leading the prosecution on this case?
Well, the credit goes to Mrs. Bates because it's her office. She's the one that would bear any scars if we tried and it came up short, because it was rather a matter that had a lot of conflicting opinions at the time, and it would have we would have been subject to a lot of second guessing after the fact. That's true.
Yeah. Now, this also is an interesting investigation because it's pretty clear to me that some of these early police files disappeared. And I don't even know that there was a transcript of when they interviewed him, back in the day. So what kind of problems did that cause when you weren't dealing with a lot of the evidence they initially had?
Well, having missing evidence, missing police reports, doesn't go in the plus column for the prosecution. And clearly, all the paperwork that dealt with the detectives' interactions with Gerald Robinson came up missing, and but for some notations by the fellow that gave him the polygraph that was kept separate and apart from the police department, all came up missing. And what happened to him, we don't know for a fact. We have suspicions, but we could never establish that as a fact.
And clearly, you met some resistance from the church. You know, I think initially when they had gone and asked for his file, I think you guys got 5 pages, and you had to do a couple no-knock warrants to get more information. Can you talk about how frustrating that was?
Well, we did contact the diocese and asked for any records, personnel files, anything that had to do with the death of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl. And my memory is we got less than 20 pages of paperwork. And it wasn't until shortly before the trial that we received reciprocal discovery from the defense, and they handed over his personnel file, which was in excess of 100 pages. So we knew at that time that the diocese apparently had a particular point of view as to how they were viewing matters. They weren't candid and forthright with us, and we went with a search warrant and even a second search warrant to try to find out if there was other records and paperwork that we weren't made privy to that we should have been.
Yeah, and I have a copy of that affidavit, and Forrester wrote, and it looked like there's a little bit of a to his tone there. I mean, he's like, "Look, you guys aren't cooperating. We know you have more records." And whose decision was it to go after those no-knock warrants?
Well, ultimately, that was something that the prosecutor had to decide, because again, it's not that easy decision to pull the trigger to indict a priest. It's not an easy decision to go searching through diocese records, and again, that's something that Mrs. Bates gets credit for, to make these tough decisions and believe in the case, which she did.
Clearly there is stuff back in the day, and I want to talk about Chief Vetter later on and Monsignor Schmidt, but do you believe that your investigation was being hindered?
Well, clearly when we ask for records and paperwork and we don't get what we lawfully requested, yes, that's a hindrance to the prosecution, and yes, that was an issue that we had to deal with.
Somebody had mentioned this, and again, if you don't want to go here, I completely understand it, but somebody had mentioned this to us, and they're like, well, they were clearly obstructing, so why can't you charge them with obstruction?
The reality is that the paperwork that we got both from defense and from our search warrant really didn't help or hinder the case. And we found it unusual that when you have a priest charged with a homicide and you had decades earlier a nun murdered in one of your chapels, you would think there'd be files about that, there'd be records about that, but there was nothing. It had been cleansed. Some opined that all that went to the Vatican years and years before, but the reality is that whatever they had initially that we had to get through that search warrant really wasn't a plus or a minus in terms of being able to prosecute the case.
So this case, 1980, when the investigation got reignited, it was 2003. You guys go to trial in 2006. 26 years. I mean, so you got cleaning ladies and people hearing footsteps on the upstairs, from 26 years earlier. What were the challenges in trying to prosecute this with some of these witnesses? You're asking them to remember something from 26 years ago.
Well, and that is the challenge of a cold case, asking the jury to be able to rely on testimony from years and years past. And so it was critical during voir dire to emphasize that there are some memories that everyone will remember even from decades ago. You may remember buying your first car if you're a guy. You may remember your first prom dress if you're a lady. Maybe you remember your wedding or the birth of your first child, everybody has memories that go back decades that they can recall. So would you remember the day the nun was killed at your place of employment? And I think that resonated with the jury, and these witnesses clearly did remember the day that Sister Margaret Ann was killed.
Now, did you have to handle them differently, like in preparation for it? I mean, how did that work?
Well, no, because it was such an out of the norm event. It was so striking, so impactful at the time. These people remembered and were able to give enough detail. Many of them, there was corroboration by a second witness who saw and heard some of the same things. So we had a fair amount of corroboration.
So another challenge for you is that when Father Robinson committed this murder, he was a 42-year-old man, probably athletic, vibrant, whatever, and he's sitting in that courtroom as a 68-year-old frail priest who's 5'5", 5'6", whatever he was. So talk about that challenge and trying to portray him, not how he is here, but how he was.
That certainly was a challenge because he looked every bit of his age. He didn't look like someone that you think would necessarily lash out at someone. And so it was critical for us, for every witness who was there at the time back in 1980. We put up a picture of him when he was, I think, 42 years old at the time of the offense, and put that contrast up and kept it up for as long as we can, so that we emphasize for the jury that we're not trying this 68-year-old little old man here at counsel table. It's this 42-year-old fellow who looks, as you said, healthy and vibrant, that did this crime.
And so there also had to be a strategy and a challenge in trying to pick a jury that could convict a priest. And I think, just talking off camera, I mean, maybe you couldn't have convicted him back in 1980, but I'm sure there's people, when you're going through this jury pool, that had very strong opinion about the church and about priests, and maybe anti-church, and maybe a priest could never kill somebody.
Well, we certainly had a number of jurors who said they could never convict a priest. They would say, remember one saying, no, a priest sits on the right hand of God. Another one said he's the Lord's messenger here on earth. And another one said, no, I could never believe a priest was capable of this. And fair enough, we anticipated having those views, and we just had to emphasize through the evidence that it isn't about him being a priest, it's about a human being who got angry, lashed out, and fortunately the evidence was such that they bought that.
Was there a fear that you weren't going to be able to get a 12-person jury that could convict him? I mean, you only have so many challenges, and I mean, was that fear that maybe we can't get rid of them all?
Oh, absolutely. It only takes one juror to say, I'm not convinced, and certainly that's a risk that you don't know how it's going to play out until the verdict is rendered.
So let's talk about strategy. I mean, there were allegations that this was a satanic ritual. What was your philosophy? What was your feeling on why this murder took place?
Well, it was clear that Sister Margaret Ann Pahl was very upset over how the Good Friday Mass was conducted. She was literally in tears, speaking with a cleaning lady at the hospital, saying, why did they cheat God out of what was his? And Sister Pahl was a very classic, old school, straight arrow, conservative nun. She was a professional woman who ran the hospital, was the CEO of the hospital with a budget of almost $100 million. She hired, she fired people, she was used to giving orders, and the belief was she let Father Robinson know that she was unhappy with how that Mass was conducted. And our theory of the case was that he was indignant at being chastised about it, and that's what set him off.
And you may have said this in your opening statement, but this was a case of a man getting angry at a woman and killing her.
No, I think that came in closing, yes. A man got very angry at a woman, and the woman died.
Yeah, that was it. So talk to me about the discussion you guys had. I know, investigators had gone to Chicago and talked to Father Grob, who is like an expert on rituals, and again, there were thoughts that this was a satanic ritual, and you guys had to have a conversation. Is this part of our strategy? Do we try to convince a jury of this? So can you just walk me through that conversation and ultimately why your strategy prevailed?
Well, there was plenty of evidence that this was a ritualistic killing that had religious overtones. There was the outline of a cross on her body. She was stabbed multiple times, and the murder weapon, which we argued was his letter opener, was completely covered with blood. And there's really no reason for it to be completely covered with blood unless that was an intentional act. And from the blood stains on the altar cloth, we have a full imprint of the murder weapon. We know it was covered with blood, and we found that she had blood on her forehead, and this letter opener had a medallion in the center of it, and there was an imprint of that medallion in blood on her forehead. Why did that take place? Why was she found stripped naked, her smock pulled up to her neck, naked to her feet, her underwear and undergarments pulled off? Why is all this happening? Why does it take place in the sacristy in front of the Eucharist? You have to deal with those things for the jury. You can't just ignore them. On the other hand, do you want to argue that this is some type of black mass, some satanic cult ritual? That's hard to accept for anyone. But those items had meaning, and Father Grob provided the meaning when he said he believed it was about humiliating her, that the assailant was furious with her, wanted to degrade her, mock her, reduce her to the lowest form, leave her naked in front of the very essence of Christ, the Eucharist, in that sacristy, who she had a wedding ring on her hand, believing that she's a bride of Christ. And so we felt we had to deal with that, and we did in a way that we didn't argue this is evidence of a black mass, this is evidence of someone with religious training who understands the significance of these things, and did it to humiliate this lady.
The unknown male DNA underneath her fingernails. What's your strategy in dealing with that? Because it wasn't his.
It wasn't his, but you have to understand, in 1980, DNA evidence as we know today was completely unknown. I don't think it was first used in a criminal case until the mid-1980s, and really didn't come to full fruition until the 1990s. And so people were not gloved, they were not gowned when they went into that sacristy. There were dozens of people that went into that sacristy. There were doctors, there were nurses, there were EKG techs, there were police officers or detectives or the people that took the body out, and none of these people were gloved. And even at the start of using DNA, we didn't understand about trace DNA. We didn't understand how the human body sheds skin cells like snowflakes we've just had in this snowstorm. And so DNA could have come from anywhere. In fact, Henry Lee testified that he did a test with his students, sent them out to buy underwear at a store that came back packaged. He would open it, test it, he'd find 2 or 3 different people's DNA on this underwear that had never been worn. So it was a different time. We didn't understand how DNA worked then.
You guys really had an all-star cast of experts. I mean, you had amazing experts.
We did. We had 3 of the 5 only recognized blood spatter experts come in and testify about matching that letter opener's imprint on the altar cloth. Yes.
So how does that even happen? Because like for a typical murder, you're not going to get Henry Lee and the bone expert to come in and do this. Was it just because it's such a high-profile case, or I mean, why?
Well, it turned out that Terry Kuzno, who's the one that discovered the outline of the upside-down crucifix, knew Dr. Lee, knew the blood spatter expert, and had the connections, and the case was unusual enough that it piqued their interest, and they were willing to participate.
Yeah. And that takes me to the exhumation. You know, Father Robinson had been arrested, I forget what month it was, but back in 2004, and then a month or 2 later, I mean, her body was exhumed, and you know, that ended up being very crucial. So how important was that to your case?
Well, we did exhume her body. We did a secondary autopsy, and that was when Dr. Scala Barnett, the coroner at the time, excised a portion of her mandible and discovered a defect that ultimately was a perfect fit for the tip of the letter opener. And the letter opener was unusual in its shape. It was diamond shaped, tapering to a point, so it was 4-sided, and as she testified, it fit like a lock and a key and a lock.
Whose decision was that? I mean, was that Mrs. Bates' decision to go ahead with that?
Yes, those are decisions the elected official makes.
I mean, that takes a lot of courage to do that, because again, you're, you know, digging up a nun, and
well, her family gave consent.
yeah, good. But I do want to talk, because there were a couple interesting witnesses, and as Assistant Chief Ray Vetter, again, that the defense team called, and I'm not, I don't know, I don't want to question them, but it surprised me that they called him. But you really grilled down on the fact that where are all these reports? I mean, talk about, I mean, you knew, I think you knew in your mind what had happened back in 1980. And so talk about your strategy in dealing with him.
Well, Detective Marks, who was the lead detective, who I had known for years, just top-notch, excellent detective, he had said, of course I did reports regarding my interview with Gerald Robinson, but they're all gone. And so I had no doubt that he did do these reports. It's ridiculous to think that he didn't do written reports regarding the main suspect. And these reports were gone. But everybody, Deputy Chief Keena and Marks, all said that Deputy Chief Vetter kept copies of all the reports. He demanded that even the reports that were made in triplicate and were supposed to go to different departments be given to him, that he kept in a private file, a locked file, in his office. He said to keep the rumors down. Ultimately, these reports disappear. They never did surface, and so he was the last person that other people said had access to them.
And, there's also the incident where he walked in on the interrogation back in 1980. He brought Monsignor Schmidt with him, and you asked him about that on the stand.
Right. He denied that he was the one that did that, but he also admitted that Monsignor Schmidt was a close personal friend of his, that he actually brought Monsignor Schmidt to the police department. He actually picked him up at his house and drove him down there, but for some reason his memory was hazy about whether he's the one that allowed him to walk in, interrupt the interview with Robinson, and ultimately Schmidt walked out with Robinson.
And there's also a really interesting exchange regarding Father, I totally forgot his name, but who had written this letter to the bishop saying that, Assistant Deputy Chief Vetter has told us he's going to have to go to the prosecutor soon with what he was kind of keeping him up to date on what was going on with the investigation, which struck me as, that's not very common, I wouldn't think. And, obviously maybe he didn't know about the letter, but you were able to get him to say, well, I didn't say any of that stuff.
Well, there was a letter by, I think it was Father Fisher to Bishop Huffman, where he recounted that Monsignor Schmidt had told him that Schmidt and Vetter had talked, that Vetter told Monsignor Schmidt that they, the police department, were soon going to be forced to go to the prosecutor to find out if they should present charges, and that Schmidt had told Father Fisher that Vetter, however, said that Vetter was keeping the police suspicions to within the department and really wasn't going to express that to the prosecutor.
Now, is there any circumstance, in your opinion, where a police chief or a police official should talk to the boss of a suspect and tell him what's going on in that investigation?
Well, and that's what I asked Monsignor, is that standard policy to be discussing the inner thoughts of the police department with the suspect's employer? But he denied that he made those statements, but couldn't explain why that information was in that letter.
Which was interesting, because then you actually came back and said, so you're saying a priest is making stuff up?
Well, I guess that can happen. Ask Gerald Robinson.
So what was going on here? What was going on? Were they colluding? Is this why he wasn't charged back in 1980?
Well, I don't have the direct answer to that, but there was plenty of talk during the trial and after the trial how the police department gave passes to a lot of misconduct by local priests. And there was kind of an unwritten policy how to handle priests if they should happen to be forced to interact with policemen.
So this goes back to what we were talking about, the jury. But, in 1980, again, priests seemed to be above the law. But in 2006, this was pretty much after the reckoning, started in Boston with the Spotlight investigation in 2002. It rippled across the country, Catholic Church reckoning. Was this pretty much the perfect time in history to try a priest for murder?
Well, the ironic thing is that if Gerald Robinson had been a janitor in 1980, he most likely would have been charged, tried, and convicted in 1980. On the other hand, if he had been indicted and was a priest in 1980, it's probably unlikely you'd get 12 jurors that would have voted guilty. But people's mindsets and views on the church and religious figures and priests in particular changed after the turn of the millennium, and with the church sex scandal and priests, it certainly made a difference in how people viewed priests and thought about what they might be capable of doing.
So when you were going into the closing argument, I mean, there's a letter opener, there's the fact that he had lied multiple times, he had said somebody else confessed to this. What did you want the jury to focus on?
Well, the first goal in this case was to be able to prove that the letter opener was the murder weapon. If we couldn't convince a jury of that, then nothing good is going to happen thereafter, because he had sole and exclusive control of that letter opener. It was found in his drawer by the police the day after the murder. So that was the first goal, prove that that is the murder weapon. Then you need to be able to demonstrate that he wasn't an honest person. He had lied about his whereabouts. He had always maintained that he was in his apartment the entire time. Yet we had witnesses come forward that saw him in front of the chapel near the time of the murder, walking down the hall at the time of the murder, seen out and about after the body was discovered. Additionally, then we had to give some kind of motive. It's not required, but it's helpful. That's why we brought in the testimony that she was angry, that Sister Paul was angry about the Good Friday service to the point of tears. So those were key factors that we really had to emphasize and make our case during the trial.
So were you convinced whenever you were done with your closing argument, the jury went back to the deliberation room, were you convinced that you'd made your case?
I always believed in the strength of the case. I always believed we had the right person. I always believed we had enough evidence. But when you're dealing with 12 people on a jury, it just takes one juror to say, I'm not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. So you don't know until the verdict is read.
So for a case that was so long and such high profile, and I think they only deliberated for about 6 hours, so what are you thinking? I know typically that could be a good thing for the state, but what were you thinking?
Well, when I heard they had a verdict in a relatively short period of time, I thought to myself, either we presented a very underwhelming case or a very overwhelming case. I didn't think we presented an underwhelming case.
And you know, Mrs. Bates had kind of touched on this. She said it wasn't like you guys popped champagne and you high-fived and celebrated, but what did you do? This was so high profile. People from around the world were paying attention to this. What did you do that night after this was all over?
I went home with my family and semi-collapsed just from near exhaustion. But yes, it was worldwide notoriety. And during the trial, I didn't have time to keep up with any of that. And about a week or so after, I'm at home on my computer reading news articles that bounced from the New York Times to a newspaper in Dublin, Ireland, to Rome, to the Middle East, to the Far East. And my eldest daughter walks by my computer screen and sees what I'm doing, and she turned and looked at me and said, "Dad, the trial's over." So I moved on to the next case.
I think Brad downstairs wanted me to ask you if you still had your GQ.
Brad, yes.
But
There was an article about it in GQ. I don't know if you looked at that. I probably have that magazine somewhere in a box.
Let me ask you this: what kind of lessons and how did this shape your career going forward? What kind of lessons did you take it as a prosecutor going forward, but now as a judge?
Well, the rule of thumb is that the longer investigation goes before you can make an arrest, usually that weakens the case. Witnesses' memories don't get better with time. Evidence can degrade. What this showed is sometimes cases can get better with the passage of time. Certainly, DNA, for example, has solved hundreds, if not thousands, of cold cases. So you don't necessarily give up and close the books. So you can get a witness coming forward that you didn't anticipate years later. There can be an admission by a defendant to someone else. You just got to keep working.
What's interesting about this case, this is going to lead into my next question, but I think there is a woman that came forward, a physical therapist supervisor or something in 2012, and she had said that she'd seen who she believed was Father Robinson coming out of the chapel, and then like 2 days later, Bishop Hoffman was like in office and said, "What did you see?" And she's like, "Oh, yeah, well, Father Robinson run out of the chapel." And he said, "You know, can you keep this between us?"
That was Grace Jones. She was a cleaning lady that cleaned out test tubes and medical equipment. Every morning around 7 o'clock she took her break and would go out and get a copy of the newspaper. And she did that morning, returned and was standing by the elevator and said she saw Gerald Robinson walk out of the chapel doors, robed up, carrying a black satchel, and he walked right by her. She also indicated that she had been told by others she should keep this to herself. No one was going to believe her as an African-American woman with a Cajun accent that was hard to understand, that accusing a priest, no one would believe her. She should just keep her mouth shut.
It's actually courageous of her to come forward and tell that story on the stand.
Well, and she did come forward. She saw the news reports. She wanted to call the police and tell them what she knew. Her son tried to discourage her, saying, "Don't get involved," but she was insistent, and her information made it way to Steve Forrester, and he spoke to her.
Hmm. Now, I only have a couple more questions, but I did overlook something I wanted to talk about early. So when this letter, we'll just call her Jane Doe, I have talked to her, and she's not going to go on camera, but I have talked to her about the whole experience, and she went before the review board. She told them, "Hey, this happened," and then the same day, there was a letter from Metz. I think he was an attorney for the diocese, and I think Cooley, who was a psychologist or something, he was on the board. He wanted to bring the case forward to the prosecutors, and this advisement from Metz was, no, you shouldn't do that, and you don't have the ability to pay for this woman's counseling. And by the way, the prosecutor's office had investigated these claims last year. I don't think they did, because that's the first time she had ever told that story.
All right, so I was not directly involved with that initially. We had one or more lawyers that screened referrals of sexual abuse and those that maybe involved priests, and the office policy at the time was if the statute of limitation had passed, there's no point going down this road. The diocese had a review board to assess claims against priests. And the individual you're talking about made her pitch saying she had been abused by a number of priests, mentioned Robinson really in passing. That wasn't the focus of who she claimed subjected her to this ritualistic abuse. She didn't want $1 million. She didn't want anything other than her counseling paid for. And this woman was a nun and a teacher in good standing at one of the Catholic high schools. To my understanding, the group decision was no, we don't find enough credibility in what she's saying. There was one member of that board, a psychologist, who did believe what she was saying and felt it should be referred to the authorities, and had made the referral to the Attorney General's office here in the state of Ohio. That office referred the matter to the Lucas County Prosecutor's office, and it was from her letter where she referenced Gerald Robinson by name that caused the cold case investigators to say, hey, let's take another look at that matter back in 1980 with the death of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl. Now, your reference to some letter from a lawyer saying that the prosecutor's office had already looked into that, that's new information to me that doesn't compute.
Yeah, I can show it. We can show. Yeah, let me show it to you right now. Just because I don't want you speaking out of turn or anything. So this was her name's redacted in here, but the original letter actually does have her name. And what is interesting is that letter was written the same day she went before the board.
That doesn't make sense time-wise. I really can't speak to that. Just the timing, to my memory, doesn't align.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense on the timeline to me.
And yeah.
If that's and plus you say that's the day she went to the board. And again, I don't know. Could it? You know, it's one and the same person. You saw the name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they just didn't want the name getting out.
No, I know who she
Yeah,
is.
yeah. So, yeah, because you know, and this came from Claudia, but Bersolati. I mean, she had all these. And she's the one that took the letter to the Ohio Attorney General's office, and so she had this, and she said, yeah, it happened, because she went before the board June 11th or July 11th, I forget what it was, and then he wrote the letter the same day.
I can't answer.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly seems like something we're trying to make this go away.
Oh, well, sure.
Yeah. And So let me just ask you about this, because I have asked the church. I mean, I had multiple conversations, emails with the church regarding, speaking with us. And in the last one, after I had a phone call and another email, it seemed to be a positive phone call. Kelly told me, we're just going to stick with what we told you before, that we can't speak to things that happened 40 years ago, which my friend told me that, well, that's very interesting, because every Sunday the church actually speaks to things that happened 2,000 years ago. but so it's interesting they would make that argument. But then I said, well, answer me this, because Bishop Thomas came to Toledo in October of 2014. Gerald Robinson died in prison July or June of 2014. This isn't ancient, and he had a full funeral mass. He never lost any of his honorifics. He was never laicized. He was still Father Gerald Robinson at the end. I mean, clearly Bishop Thomas could have done something. He could have said, hey, we made a mistake, we handled this poorly. Talk to me. Just give me a statement. Give me anything. Why? Because some people are saying that he was treated better than Sister Margaret Ann Pahl. So give me some sort of statement. Haven't heard a word. So what are your thoughts about the way he was treated after conviction and even when he died?
Well, my focus is less on how Gerald Robinson was treated than how the church viewed Sister Margaret Ann Pahl. After the homicide and after the initial flurry of police investigation, and the prosecutor's office decided at the time there wasn't enough evidence, the diocese never once reached out to the police department or the prosecutor's office and inquired about the status of the investigation as to who killed this nun in this chapel. Never once. And they never gave any consideration to this woman and to me, and I'm not Roman Catholic, and they want to give him a full priestly send-off, so be it, but it just seems like another indignation and slap at this poor woman.
So what's your message to the family? I mean, you got her justice in one sense. I mean, you got her killer, he died in prison. I don't know, but what's your message to them?
Well, there's only so much the criminal justice system can do, and I deal with it as a judge when these families come forward, and often they want answers, and they want to know why, and they want to know the who, what, when, and where. And in a prosecution, you can establish the who, what, when, and where. You usually cannot answer the why. And so why did this happen? We can argue, we can theorize, we can guess, we can hypothesize, but we never really know for a fact. So there are limits to what the criminal justice system can do. And so you have to accept what the system will allow and make peace with the unanswered questions.
So this is 20 years after his conviction. How should Toledoans view this case?
Well, this was obviously a tragic case, but as I argued, this was a case where a man got very angry at a woman and the woman died. And that still happens throughout this city, throughout the state, throughout the country. It can happen anywhere to anyone, and we do what we can do.